Will Archer was a good husband. Everyone in the county knew it. He worked from sunup to sundown, never raised his voice, came home on time, and loved his wife the way men love when they know they got lucky. His wife's name was Mary. She had red hair the color of autumn leaves and dark eyes that could read a person like a page of print. Everyone in their part of West Texas knew Mary Archer. Everyone liked her, and she loved only Will, which is what made the autumn of 1882 so hard to survive. They had been married for 6 years by then, and those 6 years had been the real kind of marriage. Not the easy kind where nothing goes wrong, but the kind where things go wrong, and you work through them together and come out the other side still standing next to each other. They had 110 acres in the western corner of Presidio County, a herd that was modest but healthy, a house that Will had built with his own hands before the wedding, because he wanted Mary to walk into something that was already hers. She had walked in and run her hand along the kitchen counter and looked at him and said it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, and he had known in that moment that he had married exactly the right woman. 6 years is long enough to know a person down to their bones. Long enough to know which silences are comfortable and which ones mean something. Long enough to know what a person looks like when they are happy and what they look like when they are pretending to be happy, and to know the difference without asking. Mary knew Will that way, and Will knew Mary that way. And this knowing was the thing they had built the marriage on, the foundation underneath everything else, the thing that made the house stand. Which is why what happened in the winter of 1881 was so destructive. Not because it was loud, because it was quiet, because it happened in the spaces that Mary was not watching, in the margins of days she trusted completely, and by the time she found out, it had already been over for 6 months. Her name was Ada. She had come to Candelaria with her brother in the winter of 1881, when the ranch had been through 2 hard seasons back to back, and Will was worn thinner than he had ever been. The cattle operation had taken losses 2 years running. First a dry summer that burned the grass to nothing, then a wet winter that took 6 head and kept both Will and Mary working at a pace that left no room for anything that was not strictly necessary. They were partners in the fullest sense, which is a good thing to be, and also a thing that can, if you are not careful, become the whole of what you are to each other. The tenderness gets crowded out by the work. The small gestures get lost in the exhaustion. You stop seeing each other the way you saw each other at the beginning, and you start seeing each other only as the person standing next to you in the middle of a hard season, which is true but is not the whole truth. And when you forget the whole truth for long enough, the missing pieces become a kind of hunger. Will had been hungry in that way, without knowing he was hungry. And Ada had been warm and uncomplicated at a moment when everything real in his life was complicated, and he had reached for that warmth the way a cold man reaches for a fire without stopping to ask whether the fire was his to reach for. It lasted 4 months. He ended it himself in April, because somewhere in the middle of March he had finally looked clearly at what he was doing and what he was risking, and the two things did not come close to balancing. He rode home from Candelaria on the last day of March, and he looked at his house from the road, the house he had built for Mary with his own hands, and he felt the full weight of what he had almost thrown away, and he ended it the next morning and told himself that ending it was enough. He told himself this for 6 months. He was wrong. Mary found out on a Sunday morning in October, right after church, in the yard outside, while everyone else was still shaking hands and talking about the weather and the price of beef. A woman named Judith Pierce walked up to her and took both her hands and held them and told her everything she knew. Judith was not a malicious woman, and she was not telling Mary in order to cause damage. She had known for 2 months and had spent 2 months deciding whether telling was the right thing, and she had finally concluded that not telling was its own form of dishonesty, and she was not willing to be part of that dishonesty anymore. She said every word slowly and clearly, holding Mary's hands the whole time, and when she finished, she said she was sorry in the voice of a woman who meant it completely. Mary thanked her, the way you thank a doctor who just told you something you did not want to hear, quietly, with a nod, because there are no other words available in a moment like that. She walked to her wagon, picked up the reins, and drove home, alone. The whole road back, she did not cry. She had expected to cry, and what arrived instead was something quieter and more fundamental. A slow, heavy shifting inside her chest, like a floorboard settling into a new position in winter. Not breaking, just becoming something slightly different from what it had been that morning. The land around her was flat and dry, and the sky above her was enormous and pale, and everything looked exactly the same as it had looked an hour ago, and nothing was the same at all. She had left the house that morning as a woman who believed certain things about her life, and she was returning as a woman who now knew that some of those things had been different from what she believed, and the distance between those two women was the length of one dirt road in West Texas on an October afternoon, and she drove it alone with her hands steady on the reins and her eyes on the road ahead. Will was not home when she arrived. He had ridden out early to check a fence on the far side of the property. So Mary put the horse in the barn and went into the kitchen and started making supper. She did not sit down and stare at the wall. She did not go through his belongings looking for evidence she did not need. She made the rabbit stew she always made on Sunday evenings, and she set the table for 2, and she waited. This was Mary, a woman who did the next necessary thing even when the next necessary thing was the hardest thing available, because she had learned from her mother and her mother's mother that falling apart was a luxury that the work of a life could not always afford. When Will came through the door that evening, the kitchen smelled exactly like every other Sunday. He hung his coat and washed his hands and turned around and saw her face. She was not performing anything. She was just standing there looking at him the way she looked at things that needed to be seen clearly, and something in the quality of that look stopped him where he stood. He knew. Before she said a single word, he understood what the evening was going to contain, and the understanding arrived not as a surprise, but as the thing he had been afraid of for 6 months, finally stepping out of the shadows where he had been pretending it did not exist. She told him to sit down. She put 2 cups of coffee on the table and sat across from him and told him that Judith Pierce had spoken to her that morning. Then she asked him in a very calm and quiet voice to tell her if it was true. And Will Archer sat at the kitchen table he had built himself and looked at the woman he had loved for 6 years and told her the truth. All of it. He told her about Ada and about the winter and about the 4 months and about the day in March when he had finally understood what he was doing and ended it. He told her he was sorry. He said it once, simply, without repeating it, because he was not the kind of man who hides behind a repetition, and because he knew that saying it 10 times would not make it more true or less damaging than saying it once. Mary listened to every word without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, long enough that the lamp on the table between them seemed to burn a little lower, long enough that outside the window, the last gray light of the October evening finished dying and the dark came fully in. Then she said she was angry. She said it the way she said everything important, plainly, looking right at him, with no extra words wrapped around it to soften the edges. She said she needed time to think, and she needed him to give her that time without pushing her toward a conclusion. She said she was not going to make him sleep in the barn because she was not interested in punishing him like a child, and because rearranging the furniture of their life around her anger would not help her think clearly. She said they were going to eat supper and she was going to think, and when she had thought enough, she would tell him what she had decided. They ate the rabbit stew in a quiet that neither of them had ever sat in before, not the comfortable quiet of two people who know each other well enough to not need words. They had had that quiet 1,000 times and knew exactly what it felt like. This was a different kind of quiet, the kind that has weight and texture, the kind you can feel pressing against your skin from the inside. Outside the window, the Texas night settled over the land, and the stars came out one by one the way they always did in October in Presidio County, and the ranch sat still and dark around them, and they were the same two people who had eaten at this table 1,000 times before, and they were also people who had never sat here before, not like this, not with this particular thing between them on the table alongside the stew and the coffee and the lamp. Will did not sleep well that night. He lay in the dark beside Mary and listened to her breathe and looked at the ceiling and thought about what he had done with the kind of honesty that only comes at 2 a.m. when there is no one left to perform for and no comfortable explanation left to hide behind. He had been tired and he had been weak, and he had made the oldest mistake a man can make. He had confused the difficulty of a real life with a deficiency in the life itself, and he had gone looking for a relief in a place that had nothing real to offer him. He understood this now with complete clarity, and the clarity did not make him feel better, which was correct, because he did not deserve to feel better yet. Mary was 3 inches away from him in the dark, and she was the furthest away she had ever been, and he had put that distance there with his own choices, and there was nothing he could do about it tonight except lie still and let her have the space she needed, and hope that space was something she would eventually choose to close. Mary lay beside him and thought too. She went back through 6 years of marriage the way you go through a house after a storm, room by room, checking what was still standing and what had been damaged. What she found was that most of it was still standing. The love was still there. She could feel it the way you feel a familiar weight, something so present for so long that its absence would be more remarkable than its presence. The life they had built was real. The ranch and the work and the daily texture of two people moving through the world together, and that realness had not been invented. Will had done something that had damaged a part of their foundation, but she was honest enough with herself to understand that the foundation was not destroyed, just cracked. And cracked things can be repaired if both people are willing to do the work of repairing them. The question was whether she was willing. And lying in the dark beside the man she had loved for 6 years, she understood that the answer was yes, and that the yes was not weakness and was not resignation. It was a choice made with full information by a woman who knew her own mind and had decided that what she had was worth fighting for, even when fighting for it meant swallowing something that tasted like fire going down. She forgave him 3 weeks later. On a Saturday morning in the kitchen while he was getting water from the bucket and she was at the stove. She turned around and looked at him and said it straight out the way she said everything that mattered. She said she had decided to stay and she had decided to forgive him, and both of those things were completely real, and he should not mistake one for the other or think that either of them was a performance. She said she was going to feel things about it for a long time, and those feelings were hers to feel, and he was going to have to be patient with them without asking her to explain them or resolve them faster than they resolved themselves. He said he understood. She nodded and turned back to the stove, and that was that. No speech, no tears, no ceremony, just Mary stating what she had decided, the way she had always stated the things that mattered most. Will stood in the kitchen with the water bucket in his hand and felt the full weight of what had just been given to him. Being forgiven by someone who has every right not to forgive you is not a comfortable feeling, and it is not supposed to be. It is one of the heaviest things a person can be handed because it means something enormous has been extended to you across a distance you created, and now you are responsible for honoring it every single day for the rest of your life, and the responsibility does not lighten with time. If anything, it gets heavier as you understand more fully what it cost the person who gave it. He honored it. That needs to be said because it is true. Will Archer was a better husband after that Saturday morning than he had been before any of it started. More attentive in the small ways, more present in the daily moments, more careful with the tenderness that had gotten crowded out by 2 hard seasons, and that he now understood was not a luxury, but a necessity. He brought her wildflowers sometimes when he rode in from the far pasture, the red ones that grew along the creek in late summer, because her hair was that color, and because he wanted her to know he still saw her, still saw the whole of her, not just the woman working beside him in a hard season, but the woman he had looked at across a room in the spring of 1876 and decided he was going to know better. Mary received all of this, and she meant all of it in return, because her love for him was real and had never stopped being real for a single day of those 3 weeks between the churchyard and the kitchen. But there was something between them now that had not been there before the winter of 1881. Something small and permanent, present in certain moments the way an old injury is present in certain weather. Not painful exactly, not disabling, just there. A slight difference in sensation that reminds you it happened even when you have stopped thinking about it. They did not talk about it because talking about it would have required naming it, and naming it would have required deciding what to do about it, and there was nothing to do about it. It was simply part of the landscape now, the way a dry creek bed is part of a landscape. You can build around it and live alongside it, and eventually stop noticing it most of the time, but it is still there, and the land remembers the water that used to run through it. The ranch grew in the years that followed. The hard seasons came and went the way hard seasons do in West Texas, indifferent to human plans and human sorrows. And Will and Mary worked through all of them side by side the way they always had. They had a daughter named Rose in 1884 who had Mary's red hair and Will's steady hands, and that child became the great joy of both their lives, the thing they pointed to without words when they wanted to say, "Look what we made, look what survived." They sat on their porch in the evenings and watched the sun go down over the flat land, and they held hands sometimes without thinking about it, the way people hold hands when it has become as natural as breathing, and they were by any honest measure a happy couple in a good marriage in a hard country. And yet there were evenings when Mary would look out at the land from the porch, and something in her face would go somewhere private for just a moment, somewhere Will could see but could not follow, and he would watch her go there and come back, and he would not say anything because there was nothing useful to say. He knew what that place was. It was the place where the thing lived that forgiveness had covered but could not remove. The small, permanent knowing that the life she had believed in completely had turned out to have a room in it she had not been shown. He had put that room there, and she had chosen to stay in the house anyway, which was the most generous thing anyone had ever done for him. And some evenings, watching her face go to that private place and come back, he felt the full weight of that generosity, so acutely it was almost more than he could sit with quietly. He never told her that. He thought about telling her many times, and he never did, because the words that were available to him never felt adequate to the thing he was trying to say, and he was a man who preferred silence to inadequacy. This was one of the things about him that Mary had always loved, and one of the things that had also, over time, cost them both something they could not quite name. Some things you understand too late to say while the person is still there to hear them. Some things you carry to the end and set down only when you have no choice. And by then, the person you wanted to say them to is already somewhere the words cannot reach. Will Archer learned this the way most people learn the hardest lessons, not in time to use the knowledge, but completely and permanently, and with the specific grief of a man who understands exactly what he had and knows with equal exactness what it cost him to almost lose it and what it cost her to let him keep it. Mary Archer wore red her whole life. At her funeral in 1911, someone put wildflowers in her hair, the red ones that grew along the creek in late summer. Will sat in the front pew and held his hat in both hands and did not speak to anyone for a long time. He lived another 4 years after that. He was never quite the same, but then neither were they. And the life they had anyway, the one built on top of the crack, on top of the forgiveness, on top of everything that had happened and everything that had been chosen in spite of it. That life was real and warm and full of the kind of love that knows what it is worth because it has come close enough to the edge to see what losing it would look like. That kind of love is not the easiest kind, but it might be the truest. Rose Archer kept the ranch until 1923. She had her mother's red hair until the day she died. She never talked about what happened in 1882, but she kept a jar of dried wildflowers on the kitchen windowsill every year until the end. The red ones, from the creek